The nervous system.
The nervous system?
The nervous system.
So the nervous system is broken down into...
two parts.
Hey dudes, the central nervous system does a lot. It controls voluntary movement, involuntary movement, thought, perception, and emotion. Well, you might be asking, what's the difference between voluntary and involuntary movement? Well, I'll tell you, you funky little amoeba. A voluntary movement is something that's controlled consciously. Movements that are voluntary involve voluntary skeletal muscles. As you could assume, these muscles attach to the skeleton. Examples of this type of movement could be moving your hands, walking, running, and dancing. Now, involuntary movements are not controlled consciously. Involuntary movements are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which is the main system that controls internal organs. Involuntary movements involve involuntary smooth muscles and cardiac muscles. Examples of involuntary movement would be breathing, digesting, sexual response, and body temp. The central nervous system consists of two parts, the brain and the spine. When looking at the brain, it's easiest to see it as a computer. It's got 100 billion neurons firing off electrical messages per second. But unlike a computer, the brain has nervous tissue, which is very delicate and requires nutrients and a blood supply. Different functions are designated to separate sections of the brain. The brain has two hemispheres, and those hemispheres can be split up into 4 sectors: the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for smell, speech, concentration, planning, problem solving, and motor control. The temporal lobe manages hearing and facial recognition. The occipital lobe controls vision and also partly reading and language. Reading and language is also a skill shared by the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Lastly, the parietal lobe is what conducts touch and pressure, taste, and body awareness. There are 12 main pairs of cranial nerves in the brain. These nerves connect the brain to the eyes, ears, head, neck muscles, and other sensory organs. Well, enough about the brain. What about the spine? The spine is pretty radical. I like to think of the spine as like an extension cord plugged into the brain. The spinal cord has 5 sections: the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and the coccygeal. What does each part control? Well, I'll tell you. The cervical controls the neck muscles, diaphragm, deltoid, wrist, triceps, and fingers. The lumbar controls hips, quadriceps, hamstrings, and feet. And the sacral controls penile erection, bowel, and bladder. And the thoracic controls the hands, intercostals, abdominals, and ejaculation. So, how does the spine do what it does and does what it do? Well, the spine is what's used to transmit messages from the brain to all the different parts of the body. It transmits these messages by... What's that sound? That alarm means it's time to talk about neurons! Neurons connect together and send signals and messages from the brain to the spine. These bad boys are basically the marshmallows and the Lucky Charms of the nervous system. They're the most important part of the nervous system. And there's a lot of them. There are around 100 billion neurons within the brain and spinal cord. That's a lot. To imagine how crazy a lot that is, think of 100 billion bees. That's a lot of bees. That's a lot of bees! Oh shit! Oh my god. Phew. That was a close one. Well, because there are so many neurons in your body, you gotta wonder, how do they all fit in there? Well, nerves are incredibly small. They can range from sizes like 4 microns to 100 microns. Wow! Well, let's take a closer look at a neuron. This is a neuron. A neuron has three main components: the dendrites, the axon, and the cell body, which can also be called the soma. A neuron can be looked at as a tree, where the cell body is the trunk, the dendrites are the branches, and the axons are the roots. There are also these little things on the dendrites called spines, and those can be considered the leaves. The cell body, known as the trunk, is where the nucleus is, which means it's also where the DNA is stored. The trunk is where proteins are made, which then go throughout the cell, to both the axon and the dendrites. Now, let's look at the axon, aka the roots. Not that one band. The axon is where action potential is generated for the cell. Action potential is basically like an electrical message. It's how neurons communicate. The axon is what action potential travels down to then release the neurotransmitter into the synapse. The synapse is where two neurons meet. Now, to continue this line of communication, that's where dendrites come into play. Dendrites are what receive this message from the axon. And if we take a closer look at the dendrite, we can see these tiny little things called spines. These things are basically the contact site on the dendrite, which makes communication possible. Hormones travel between nerves as chemicals that influence your emotions. Hormones are released in three ways: by humoral stimuli, hormonal stimuli, and neural stimuli. For the sake of today's topic, we'll focus on neural stimuli. Neural stimuli is when the nervous system sends a direct message to the endocrine glands to release hormones. An example of one of these hormone chemicals is dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical released that is responsible for feelings of happiness, reward, and motivation. It's the chemical that's released after you finish all your work or complete a task. While this chemical is a great motivator, it's also highly addictive and is also released when consuming drugs and/or alcohol. This is why most say it makes you feel good when consuming them.
You try to protect your children, but once they walk out the door, they're on their own.
No.
Yo, Carlos, you got some cosito? Yeah, got some noodles, man. It's a good blow, man. We just try something. I got some pops, some real nice pops.
No, man.
Talk to your kids about offers of drugs. Help your children to just say no.
I went from hotshot lawyer to cocaine addict.
The peripheral nervous system, or PNS.
I thought that was part of the reproductive system.
No, I said PNS.
Oh.
Is essentially what connects the central nervous system to the rest of the body. It is also broken down into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system.
According to the peripheral nervous system section of training.seer.cancer.gov, the somatic nervous system, which I'll call the SNS, quote, conducts impulses from the brain and spinal cord to skeletal muscle, causing us to respond or react to changes in our external environment, end quote. Here's a breakdown of kinds of nerves in the SNS. Cranial nerves. 12 pairs, all of which but one, the vagus nerve, pass through foramina, holes in the skull. They innervate, give feeling and control to the head, neck, and face. Spinal nerves, a closer look. The spinal nerves are each connected to the spinal cord by their own dorsal root and ventral root. The dorsal root ganglion is where the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are, and the motor neurons are in the spinal cord's gray matter. The roots connect to form the nerves, all of which are called mixed nerves, which means that they contain both sensory and motor neurons. The autonomic nervous system can be broken down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. It also takes care of your organ muscles and, keeps your body going on the inside, because without it, where would any of us be? Your stomach doesn't move by itself, idiot. It performs processes automatically and with little to no effort, and innervates important things like glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle, like my pal mentioned earlier. The sympathetic division prepares your body for stressful situations that require energy expenditure. The parasympathetic division is the part of the nervous system that slows the heart, dilates blood vessels, decreases pupil size, increases digestive juices, and relaxes muscles in the gastrointestinal tract for pooping and stuff. The parasympathetic division also maintains things like homeostasis in the body, so that not everything is whack. Just a little bit. What the heck is a nerve? Well, I'm glad you had the nerve to ask. Actually, you didn't. I did. I asked it for you. A nerve is essentially a bundle of neurons. Looks a little something like this. Cool.
Some of our guests stay at Portland area Shiloh Inn. Visit Oregon's premier resort on the Oregon coast, Shiloh Inn at Lincoln City.
Nervous system. I'm getting nervous. Two major components. Central and peripheral. They are important. Know your nervous system. Broken down into the central and peripheral. That's your brain and spine, and also all of your nerves. Helps you feel and think and see and breathe. So you know exactly when you can leave. Nervous system.